yeah, first of all, of course, it's a great honor to speak in this series, in the deLIGHTed Talks series. There's many other great researchers and practitioners in the field have talked here, so it's great to be here, and thanks for the invite. And just to introduce myself shortly, which Chana already did greatly. So I'm now a postdoc in the Healthy Living Spaces Lab led by Professor Marcel Schweiker at the RTWH Aachen University. And I also put Chana's university here in Geneva and also my former affiliation in Maastricht here, because the study that I will be mostly talking about was conducted during my PhD at Maastricht University in collaboration with Chana in Geneva. So I would like to start by stating the obvious, that we spend 90% of our time indoors, especially during daytime. And so that means that nowadays we not only spend too much light, we not only spend so much time in the evening in too much light, as Catherine pointed out, we also spend it in too little daylight, which is a factor that is being a little bit under-researched in my opinion. That's also why I picked that up for my talk today. And obviously, when you compare outside versus indoors, there are big differences that are, I think, nicely illustrated between these two pictures. And that, of course, also applies to, this is a hospital room at the clinic where I'm working, where we don't get much natural light into these rooms, very little access to windows usually in these buildings. And of course, the aspect that Catherine already covered with the light in the evening, that we know is, for the most part, detrimental to metabolic health outcomes. So this just as an introduction, and I will really focus on the daytime component and thereby on the natural daylight versus artificial light discussion. And I would like to start by first describing what the crucial differences are when we talk about these two light sources. And I guess we all know from own experiences then that there can be big differences. Some of them we might not always perceive ourselves, but if we talk about intensity, which is measured in lux, as most of you will know, we know that in most of our office rooms, and for example, in my home office right now, I'm pretty sure I'm not even reaching 150 lux. And although it's recommended to go up to 400, maybe 500 lux for indoor offices, most offices and most buildings will not facilitate that these days yet, unfortunately. If we then move higher up the spectrum, going outside, and on an overcast to cloudy day, it can still be up to 10,000 lux, although here we have an indication of 1,000 lux. If we then go on into a more sunny day situation, the 50,000 lux are still underestimating reality in most cases, so that on a very sunny day, midday at 12 p.m., there can be even values measured up to 100,000 lux. Next to this obvious intensity difference, I think that most of us know very well from own experience, there's of course also this difference in wavelength properties, so that we have natural light being much more saturated over the entire visible wavelength spectrum that you see illustrated here on the x-axis. And if you then look at artificial light sources, for example, LED, fluorescent and incandescent light bulbs, then you see that they show very different patterns over this visible wavelength spectrum compared to natural light, which is just much more saturated over the entire spectrum. So there we have these pretty obvious differences. And I saw that in previous deLIGHTed talk series, some of the speakers introduced themselves by showing their typical light exposure patterns, which I found really funny and nice to illustrate. So I also did that and would like to make the point here that even a light researcher as myself spends most of his time indoors, obviously. So what I did to showcase that a little bit over the last weeks, also because I'm testing a new device that is out there, which is called Act Lumos. You see me wearing it here as kind of a necklace that attracts attention from your colleagues and friends, I can tell you, but that's another story. And then you see on the y-axis that I plotted photopic illuminance here in lux, and you see that the y-axis is not linear, it's actually going exponentially up, always times 10, and you see up to 100,000 lux, which would be values then in really bright sunlight outside. So to show you how my typical light pattern looks like, this little device actually gives you a value every minute. And you see that with sunrise, it starts to increase. And you see a lot of dots, some patterns, even in the morning hours going above 1,000 lux, which is probably me spending some time close to a window. But then you see most of the data points here around 100 lux, which is actually because I spend most of the time there in my office in Aachen, and it was a cloudy day on this day, so that this little poor light bulb here was my sun indoors, so to speak, and that only resulted in lux values of around 100. If I then go to have a little lunch, I go outside, and that gives me some higher values up in the 10,000 range. And if I spend some time outdoors later in the day, it was a very sunny day later that day, picked up my daughter at daycare, and we spent some time outside, and then you can see, okay, there I reach values going up to 100,000 because the device is in direct sunlight. And then something maybe for the later evening, which is nice, also considering Catherine's recommendations that she mentioned, that after sunset, so you see the sharp decrease here, this is sunset, that after that I managed to spend my evening in below 10 lux values, which is a nice confirmation for myself. And but still, for daytime values, I think there's still much to improve, because if you plot what would be going on outside in terms of sunlight, it would probably look something like this. So I just did that very roughly over here to make a point here, that of course there's a lot of room in between. So if we would compare the area under the curve, it would be very much different compared to outdoors, what I was exposed to. So that in mind, that I also fail with being exposed to sufficient daylight compared to the outside situation, I would like to introduce how light is linked to blood sugar, and particularly in type 2 diabetes. And the first study that came to my mind, but you could also take one of the studies that Catherine introduced nicely, was a study done in Amsterdam, where they put people in front of a light therapy lamp or in dim light conditions, and measured blood sugar levels after a meal, a standardized meal, and had either healthy people, age matched to type 2 diabetes patients, and had them either in front of this light therapy lamp in 4,000 lux or in 10 lux in a dim light condition from 7:30 a.m. onwards, or and gave them a breakfast at 8:30. And for the healthy people, it looks as we would expect. So the open dots here is the bright light, the 4,000 lux. The black is the dim light. You see that the glucose levels increase right after the meal and go back to normal values pretty quickly within half an hour to an hour maybe. And that is what we would expect in the healthy condition. But for a type 2 diabetes patient, the picture looks very different. You see that they already start with a much higher baseline before the meal already, and then you can see it increase to much higher levels in general, and also keeps being higher for longer time, which is typical for type 2 diabetes and basically defines the disease as well. But you also see that the light has an influence in these patients, so that the white dots here, so the brighter light, leads to higher glucose levels, also in line with what Catherine showed you before, only that there they found higher insulin levels. So we also did a study, a little bit inspired by these findings from the group in Amsterdam. What we did was to also enhance daytime brightness, not only in the morning with breakfast, but over the entire daytime. And we took overweight and insulin-resistant people, which you would probably coin as being pre-diabetes, having pre-diabetes. And so we exposed them to light from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Versus, again, dim light, also 10 lux. And we chose a little bit less bright light stimulus than in the previous study. We chose 1,250 lux, which is, I always say, as bright as if you would be standing in the fridge section in the supermarket and just facing it, opening the door as the lady is here. And what did we find? So if we measure blood sugar after this day, so just at 6 p.m., we actually found that enhanced brightness during daytime lowers blood sugar levels. It was not a big effect, but it was consistent over these participants that we had enrolled in the study. So keep this in mind as a connection. But we thought, okay, maybe daylight is perhaps even more potent because, as I showed you, it gets even brighter. It is more saturated over the entire wavelength spectrum that we can see. So we wanted to test if it's more potent. So that's why we applied for funding at the Velux Stiftung together with Chana Dibna, and we're lucky to receive funding to conduct a study to test if natural daylight through windows in an office setting improves glucose control and also blood sugar control and 24-hour energy metabolism in type 2 diabetes patients. And just to illustrate, of course, that if you think of an office environment, that most of the time, or this is a teaching room where you have the room only lit by artificial light sources, it makes, of course, a huge difference when you have, as illustrated here, many windows that don't make it even necessary during daytime to have any artificial light sources on. So the hypothesis for this study was that if we would put type 2 diabetes patients in an office environment from Monday to Friday, so for 5 days, that would be beneficial for metabolic health outcomes when compared to constant artificial lighting. And we had 13 diabetes patients in the study that went through the entire study. The mean age was about 70 years. As you can imagine, that people basically had to be retired to having the time to participate in such a study, as it takes, I think nobody would take holidays for participating in such a study. So that was kind of a given, 70 years as a mean age. People were not on insulin treatment, of course, with elevated blood sugar levels, diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, but they maintained other diabetes medication in the study, but really kept that intake and dosage the same between light conditions. We used a randomized controlled crossover study design that I hope many of you are familiar with. It basically means that every participant went through both light conditions, but in a randomized order. And in this scheme, day 1 is the typical Monday, whereas day 5 is the Friday. People were exposed to the either natural light or artificial light from 8 a.m. onwards on that Monday, starting on that Monday until 5 p.m. And that was kind of a transition period, and they spent each evening from 6 p.m. until 11 p.m. in dim light, below 5 lux. And that we repeated over 3 days. And then on the 4th day, we measured a lot of things. So we draw blood at many times of day. We conducted so-called ventilated hood measurements to analyze breath gases. I will show that and speak a little bit about that on one of the next slides. We also collected saliva samples to determine melatonin levels in the evening, and even conducted blood samples during the night, and also performed another meal challenge test the next morning. So a lot of outcomes. I will not have time, obviously, to go into all these outcomes, but focus on the most exciting ones, in my opinion. So for practical considerations, how did we put that study design into practice? How did the light conditions look like? I think that's probably for most of you most interesting. So this was the natural light condition. So we had people sitting in this corner for most of the time between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. And sitting here on a very sunny day, we measured up to 4,000 lux at midday. And on a cloudy day, these values still went up to 1,000 lux. And just for you to know, whenever the sun really hit the table, which was very much possible on a very sunny day, we moved the table back a little bit to not have the participant exposed to sunlight directly. This was the, unfortunately, a little bit poor and sad corner of artificial light. So just artificial light sources. It was set up in the same room so that here was basically furniture to block the light coming from here, so that the participant sitting here only got the artificial light, and that was set to constantly 300 lux at the eye level sitting here. Just summarizing the characteristics of the 2 light conditions. So this was, we performed regular spectrometer measurements. You see that in the natural light condition, with the yellow colors meaning high saturation at that wavelength over the time exposure, where the time where they're exposed to light. You see that it pretty much doesn't change much over a typical office light. This is an individual example pattern, but it was very consistent between most participants. And in contrast to that, you see again, poor in that regard artificial office lighting with a lot of blue colors, so meaning less saturation at those wavelengths, and also showing you that it was a fluorescent and LED mixture of light bulbs that we used here. Just to show you what kind of average values we had in this study. So the red line is the natural light. You see up to 2000 lux, and you see that the artificial light condition is about constant at 300 lux. Our primary outcome in this study was continuous blood sugar monitoring. We used the devices from Abbott that are placed on the forearm. You might have seen people walking around with that on the street. On a hot day, you can see it on the arm of people. These devices we also use. It gives you a blood sugar value every 15 minutes. Sorry for that. And you see an example pattern here from one of the participants. So you see the 3 peaks for the 3 meals, because we always gave them breakfast, lunch, and dinner at standardized times. So you also see that the peaks really align between days, so from Monday to Friday. And you see values in gray, which is the time in normal range, where people that don't have diabetes are most of the time. So you see that the yellow is something, so the yellow range is something typical for type 2 diabetes. It's too high for maintaining healthy blood conditions. And you see also sometimes that during the night it actually goes into a red area, which is too low, which is also not a good thing to have too low blood sugar levels, as we need it for energy supply, obviously. So to summarize, of course, as you saw in the study design, there were many things that we looked at. Shana is also still looking at some samples from this study. So I only showed you the peak of the iceberg, so to speak. So I showed you natural office lighting was associated with more time in normal glucose range, normal blood sugar range, which is good for type 2 diabetes patients, higher fat burning during wake time, and also for a meal test in the morning. And we showed higher melatonin levels in the late evening. However, what I also didn't show you some other nice effects, just for the sake of time, but many outcomes also were not different between light conditions, and I would like to be transparent and mention them. So we measured core body temperature, which was not different over a 24-hour period. Subjective sleep quality, to our surprise, was not different. So people did not report that they slept better in the natural light, for example, as one might otherwise assume. Sleep substrate metabolism was also not different. So there we also looked at the breath gases during sleep. 24-hour blood substrate metabolites were not different. So I only showed you the glucose monitor on the arm. Actually, in plasma and blood, we could not detect such differences for a single representative day that we had. And we also looked at 24-hour blood pressure and heart rate, and that was also not different between conditions. So to conclude, just from this study, of course, we need more studies looking at maybe more dynamic artificial lighting as control. But in this study, repeated window facilitated daylight exposure during office hours had a positive impact on metabolic health for type 2 diabetes patients when compared to typical constant artificial light. And with that, I would like to acknowledge all the people that were involved. So that is mainly, I hope my mouse is visible, my cursor. Yes, so Chana Dibner as a collaborator, my main supervisor on this project in Maastricht, Joris Höchst, Ivo Harbitz that you see here, and the rest of the team that really helped me with, as you saw in the design, a lot of measurements during the night, so a lot of night shift for all of us. So that was a big team effort that I could have never done myself. So thank you for that. And also Mareike Gordin, who's I think also in the session and who helped us with the melatonin assessment. And lastly, I would like to promote a science communication effort that I started a few years ago. So if you're interested in these topics that I just mentioned, I interviewed a lot of people active in the field. And I guess for this audience here in the deLIGHTed talks, it's really Nice to mention here a discussion I had with Professor Russell Foster from Oxford on comparing daylight versus electric light for health, but there are also many other topics that you might find interesting, and you find these on 247muscle.com, on Spotify, and so on. And with that, thank you for your attention, and of course, happy to take any questions and comments.